Hey everyone, Cody Hayes here, and I'd like to welcome you to part three as we look at the book of Acts. And where we left off was with the Council of Jerusalem. I mentioned how this is essentially a proto-council to what took place centuries later in the early 4th century at Nicaea. And the reason why is because Nicaea has gone down in history as the first ecumenical council of Christianity. And of course, that's where you have the gathering of all the bishops of the church or their representatives there. And during this time period, with the book of Acts, we do know of bishops that the apostles would have ordained, consecrated, because they're referenced in Paul's letters, but we don't know how many of them were present at Jerusalem for this particular council. So it's viewed as a proto-council to what took place in Nicaea in the early 4th century. But the main issue with the Council of Jerusalem involved circumcision, which traditionally is how one entered the covenant with Abraham's God. Well, Peter, Jesus' main apostle from his earthly ministry, declared, why should we put that yoke of burden on the Gentiles, the non-Jews? In other words, why should we force them to undergo circumcision? Isn't baptism good enough? And of course, the traditional theology regarding baptism, is that it's seen as the replacement for circumcision. And then James, Jesus' brother slash kinsman and the leader of the church in Jerusalem, agrees with Peter, but states that church leaders should inform Gentiles to abstain from things that have been polluted by idols and to abstain from non-kosher food. So James, the brother slash kinsman of Jesus and the leader of the church in Jerusalem, agrees with Peter it's not necessary for the Gentiles to undergo circumcision, but that Gentiles should abstain from things polluted by idols. In this case, we would be referring to food offerings that were made to the various Greco-Roman gods and to non-kosher food, that is, food that violates the dietary laws of the Torah. But here are some questions relating to the Council of Jerusalem. Does Peter's speech at the Council of Jerusalem reflect more of a Pauline theology than his own? The whole yoke of burden regarding circumcision and the Torah in many respects, this really relates more to Paul, particularly in the letter to the Galatians. And I think specifically of the Antioch incident that took place in the letter to the Galatians, where Peter and Paul had a confrontation regarding issues related to the dietary laws. So, this might reflect maybe a little more of, Pauline theology getting into the book of Acts, whether done by Luke or a copyist. The other question is, has James and his successors in Jerusalem been demoted through the centuries of Christianity? And the reason that I ask this question is because at the end of the first century, the original patriarchy of bishops was Rome at the top, then Alexandria, then Antioch, and then Jerusalem. But a lot of historians have thought that Jerusalem and its bishop, the successor of James, should be much higher on the list. To add a little bit to that point, to emphasize it, I'm going to read here a portion from the Gospel of Thomas. The Gospel of Thomas is a sayings gospel. There's no narrative to it. And it has been thought as being a Gnostic gospel, although that's questionable. But here is a portion from the Gospel of Thomas. The disciples said to Jesus, "We know that you are going to leave us. Who will be our leader?" Jesus said to them, "No matter where you are to go to James the Just, for whose sake heaven and earth came into being." So James is referenced pretty prominent there in the Gospel of Thomas. Whereas, of course, in the canonical Gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, particularly Matthew and John, Peter is the main disciple. So, what would be some arguments that have been made for why James perhaps was demoted? Well, some historians have wondered about the after effects of the Roman Jewish War and the destruction of Jerusalem, that essentially caused James and his successors to not have the prominence that they did prior to that. At the same time, though, James, and this can be seen in the book of Acts, has a more liberal attitude regarding the Torah, the law, than certainly Paul did in his writings. So an argument has been made that when Paul's theology essentially won, that James and his point of view and those that came after him um, basically were demoted. But let's look forward now, more forward with the book of Acts. We have here the we passages. Most of the book of Acts, it's written from a third person perspective. However, beginning in chapter 16, Luke begins to write at times from a first person plural perspective, and there are the passages related to this. So most of the book of Acts, it's written from a third person perspective, but you do have at points beginning in chapter 16 where it's now written from a first person plural perspective. You know, the use of the pronouns we and us, beginning what's known as the we passages. Well, this suggests that Luke was an eyewitness to a lot of the events and was a traveling companion of Paul. However, historians question this due to how Luke presents Paul versus how Paul presents himself in his own writings. I mentioned at the start of this lecture, and I also mentioned this when we looked at the Gospel of Luke, that traditionally speaking, Luke is viewed as a disciple of Paul, a companion of Paul, and the we passages, confirm this that Luke was an eyewitness account to these events. But historians question this due to how Luke presents Paul in the book of Acts versus how Paul presents himself in his own writings. So let's look at some of this, what's known as Luke's Paul versus Paul's Paul. Well, in Luke's account of Paul's conversion, Luke mentions that a man named Ananias helped restore the eyesight of Paul. Then Paul's baptized. Then from Damascus, Paul goes to Jerusalem where he meets with the other apostles. Paul does mention in his own writings about an event that took place on the road to Damascus where he had an experience, but he doesn't really go into much detail about it. Luke does, where, of course, Luke mentions that you have a man named Ananias who restores the eyesight of Paul because Paul was blinded from the event where he's knocked off his horse. Then he's baptized into the Christian faith. Then from Damascus, he goes on to Jerusalem and he meets with the other apostles. Okay, that's in Luke. But in Paul's account from the letter to the Galatians, Paul's own letter, he states how he did not confer with any human being, and he did not go up to Jerusalem until 3 years after this particular conversion experience. So, in Paul's own account from his letter to the Galatians, he states how he did not confer with any human being. There was no encounter with this Ananias, and he did not go up to Jerusalem until 3 years later. And in fact, when he went to Jerusalem, the only individuals he saw related to the apostles were he saw Peter, or Cephas, as he refers to him as, and James, the brother slash kinsman of Jesus. But other than that, no one. Very, very different from what Luke writes. Another difference here, the main thesis of Paul's theology slash philosophy, such as what's found in the letter to the Galatians, is that the death of Christ does away with the Jewish Torah slash law. That's the main thesis overall of Paul's theology, that the death of Christ does away with the Jewish Torah slash law. But in the book of Acts, Paul violates this theology, this philosophy, by engaging in Torah rituals. So in the book of Acts, Paul violates his own theology, his own philosophy by engaging in Torah rituals. He circumcises his spiritual son Timothy, and he also engages in a Torah ritual involving a Nazirite vow at the temple in Jerusalem. Another difference here. In Paul's speech to the Athenians in the book of Acts, he states how the Gentiles, the non Jews, are ignorant about the one true God. That's the speech to the Athenians where he talks about how they're very religious, etc., etc. But he mentions how they're ignorant regarding the one true God, the God of Abraham. However, in the opening of Paul's letter to the Romans, Paul states how the Gentiles know full well, and I emphasize that point, that there is one true God, the God of Abraham. So again, in the book of Acts and the speech to the Athenians, Paul states how the Gentiles, the non Jews, are ignorant about the one true God, the God of Abraham. But in the opening of the letter to the Romans, Paul states that the Gentiles, they know full well that there's one true God, and that is the God of Abraham. But rather than acknowledge him, they do all these other things, etc., etc. But they know full well that he is the one true God. So you have a difference there where on one side, Paul states that the Gentiles are ignorant, but on the other side, they know full well. Well, next we're going to see if these differences can be reconciled. So take care. I will symbolically see you then.